For 20 years, I had walked those mountains as if they were the lines on my own hand. I knew every game trail, every whisper of the wind. But that bitter morning in 1997, I came across a story told in footprints, a tale unlike any I had ever read. Some instinct older than reason commanded me to follow. And there I found what no hunter's lore ever prepares you for: a Sasquatch breathing its last on a bed of pine needles. When its eyes met mine, I saw no monster. I saw a consciousness as ancient as the mountains, a spirit too weary for deception. And the truth it whispered about our kind with its final shuddering breaths was not a warning. It was a judgment, a truth I was never meant to carry. My name is James Mitchell. I am 42 years old, and for the last 4 years this cabin outside Pine Ridge has been my world. Washington knows me, if at all, as a shadow. The quiet man who trades venison for silence, the one who offers a curt nod, but never a conversation. They cannot see the 12 years burned into me by the Army, the ghosts of a Central American jungle that still cling to my soul. They don't know the story of the night I carried my best friend's broken body through 11 hours of a green, screaming hell, only to feel his life slip away on a medevac bound for a world he'd never see again. They don't need to know that a part of James Mitchell was buried that night right alongside Tommy Garcia. If you've ever had a day that changed everything, let me know in the comments below. That morning dawned like 1,000 others. I rose at 5:30 in my small timber frame cabin, coaxing coffee from an old Mr. Coffee machine, the one piece of comfort I'd allowed myself in years, and I inspected my gear. My Remington 700 was pristine ready. I tended to my weapons with a discipline the Army had forged in me, a ritual of order in a life that had long since surrendered to chaos. My destination was Eagle Ridge, where elk had left their scripture 2 days before. November's hunting season was a coming storm, and I had to read the terrain. The journey up Timber Trail Road was a 40-minute prayer in my '89 Ford F-150. The truck groaned over ruts and scars left by timber companies that had long since plundered these woods and moved on. The radio offered only the hiss of static, the voice of the empty spaces between towns. So I drove in a sacred silence, watching the mist breathe between the colossal Douglas firs, a living, moving spirit in the dawn. I left the truck at the road's end and settled the weight of my pack on my shoulders. Alongside the rifle, I carried the essentials: water, a first aid kit, rope, a compass, and a topographic map sheathed in a waterproof skin, the litany of a soldier, a creed that time could not erase. My Motorola pager, a relic of another life, was clipped to my belt, though its silence was rarely broken. Its only connection was the town butcher who summoned me only when there was work to be done. The climb to the ridge was a brutal but known penance. I had first walked these slopes as a boy, long before the uniform, before Tommy, before the great unraveling. It was here my father taught me to read the forest language, to move like the silence itself. He was a logger and a hunter, gone now for 15 years. I sometimes wondered what he would make of the man I had become, a phantom haunting the woods, finding more solace in the quiet company of trees than in the world of men. 2 hours into the ascent, I saw them. The tracks. At first, my mind registered them as the prints of a barefoot man pressed into the damp earth by a seasonal creek, each one a perfect, deep declaration. But as I knelt, my hunter's eye caught the unsettling details that defied all logic. The print was immense, a full 17 inches long. Yet it was not the clawed mark of a bear. It possessed 5 distinct toes arrayed like a man's, but on a scale that was monstrous. The sheer depth of the impression spoke of a creature with the weight of a grizzly, and the space between each step was an impossible 5.5 feet. Of course, I knew the legends. Here in Washington, the story of Bigfoot is woven into the fabric of the night, told around campfires, seen in blurry photographs, and sworn to by men who'd had one too many. I had always filed these tales under myth, a modern folklore. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button to let me know. But these tracks were not a story. They were a fact etched into the earth no more than 6 hours ago, and they were leading straight up away from any known trail into a wilderness so dense and untamed that most men dared not enter. Every rational thought screamed for me to turn back to mark this anomaly on my map and resume my hunt for elk. Instead, I found myself moving, following the tracks as my hunter's soul completely overthrew the rule of my mind. Whatever made these prints was a giant, and a part that had been dormant for 4 long years had to see it. The trail it blazed led me away from the familiar paths and into a cathedral of old-growth forest where the canopy was so dense that it starved the light, leaving the forest floor open and easy to walk. I moved with a practiced quiet, my body defaulting to the ghost-like patrol rhythms I had perfected in the jungle. Step, pause, listen, scan, repeat. An unnatural silence had fallen over the woods. Not a single bird called out, no squirrels chattered. There was only the sigh of the wind in the high branches and the metered rhythm of my own breath. After tracking for what felt like an hour, I saw the blood. At first, just tiny rubies, dark and stark against the emerald green of the moss. And then, a darker poetry appeared on the forest floor, a crimson thread of droplets, a testament running parallel to the prints. The creature I pursued was wounded. My heart beat a frantic drum not of fear, but of an old familiar ghost. The hunter's instinct born in another wilder place. For an injured beast is a verse of unpredictable fury, a sonnet of danger. Caution was the wise man's path, but some unseen current pulled me onward deeper into the tale. The crimson stains grew bolder, more insistent. Its life's ink was spilling too quickly upon the page of the earth. The trail, my grim narrator, led me toward a rocky stage where cedars ancient as time itself stood as a silent, judging audience. The crimson sentence came to an abrupt, dark period before a small cavern, a grotto, formed where 2 monolithic boulders leaned together like weary gods. And there nestled in the ink-black shadows, I finally saw it. At first, my mind was a stubborn scholar refusing to read the text my eyes presented. The sheer scale, the impossible grammar of its form. Then, a subtle shift in the shadows and a cold, terrible literacy washed over me. It was a Sasquatch, a living, breathing myth made flesh. It lay upon its side a fallen titan, its chest a great bellows struggling for air. Even in repose, its immensity was a saga unto itself. It had to stand over 7 feet tall, perhaps even cresting 7.5. A mantle of thick umber fur covered its form, now cruelly marred with a scarlet tapestry along its flank. Its visage was partly veiled, turned from me, but I could discern the powerful sculpture of its jaw, the heavy shelf of a brow that spoke of ancient sorrows. For a measureless moment I was a statue, my rifle a useless scepter, my mind a tempest of warring philosophies. Every page of reason in my soul's library screamed that this was impossible. The Sasquatch was not meant to be real. It was a ghost story, a chapter of folklore, a trick of the light. And yet the creature before me was terrifyingly real, and it was composing its final elegy. I've read The Face of Death too many times not to know its language in the humid jungles, the sterile hospitals, and in the fading light of Tommy Garcia's eyes. This being wore that same expression, breathed that same shallow meter, held that profound stillness of a life preparing to cross its final silent river. Slowly, with the weight of that realization, I lowered my rifle and took one measured step into its world. And then its eyes opened deep brown pools of startlingly human awareness that found and held my own. I was rooted to the spot, every primal instinct a chorus screaming for flight. Even wounded, its power was a palpable thing capable of ending my story in a single, brutal heartbeat. But it did not stir to violence. It simply held my gaze with those impossibly sage eyes, and I saw entire volumes in their depths, pain yes, but also a quiet resignation, an acceptance, and something else entirely. What do you think that something else was? Drop your theories in the comments below, I'd love to read them. Was it recognition? As if my arrival was not a chance encounter but a long-awaited appointment. Easy now, I heard my own voice, a rough draft spoken into the silence. I'm not going to hurt you. The creature answered with a sound from the deep earth, a resonant rumble that was neither growl nor word. It moved its great weight with a whisper of effort, and with that movement I saw the wound in stark relief. A brutal smile carved into its flank, deep and ragged. This was not the work of man's malice, but the careless cruelty of the mountain itself, a jagged rock, perhaps, or a spear of broken timber. The flow of its life had slowed to a steady seep, but it had not ceased. In a man, such a wound would scream for the surgeon's knife. Out here, in the heart of nowhere, it was a final, unanswerable verdict. With deliberate care, I shrugged the pack from my shoulders. The creature's ancient eyes followed every motion, but it remained a statue of trust as I retrieved my first aid kit. My meager kit was a child's prayer against a hurricane, but I had to offer it. I could not be a simple witness to this epic's end. "I'm a medic." I said the words, a soft offering, knowing their meaning was likely lost in translation. But the chasm of silence between us demanded a bridge. "Well, I was a lifetime ago. I'm going to try to help you. If you think a moment of compassion like this deserves it, please give this video a like." And so I approached a pilgrim to a forgotten shrine, its gaze a constant weight upon me. At arm's length, I paused, offering it a final veto. In response, it made another sound. This one was softer, a low thrum of inquiry. And then the unbelievable happened. It adjusted its massive form, a subtle gesture that granted me passage to its wound. It was trusting me. My hands, veterans of 1,000 other wounds, trembled as I opened my kit. Up close, the injury was a raw, brutal poem. I could see the torn stanzas of muscle, the stark white punctuation of bone. It needed a surgeon's art, not my fumbling prose. All I possessed were a few squares of gauze, a roll of tape, and a bottle of antiseptic, a thimble of water against a raging fire. "This is going to burn," I whispered, a promise I hated to keep as I poured the liquid fire into the gash. Its great muscles went taut as steel cables, but it did not pull away. I worked with a frantic haste, using every last bandage to staunch the flow. I wrapped the wound as tightly as I could, binding it with tape and a length of rope from my pack. It was a fool's hope, a bandage on a mortal blow. We both knew this chapter was already written. When I finished my futile work, I sat back a humble student before this impossible master. Up close, I could see the silver threads of time woven through its umber coat, the deep cartography of wisdom etched around its ancient eyes. It possessed the weathered grace of a being who had watched the seasons turn for centuries. "How old are you?" I asked, the silence a question cast into the void. The creature held my gaze for a long, heavy moment, and then, to my utter astonishment, it spoke. Its voice was like the grinding of mountains, deep and resonant, the words carrying a strange, ancient cadence, but they were nonetheless unmistakable. 102 years. My world tilted on its axis. If you were as stunned as I was, share this video because some stories need to be told. It could speak. Words like ancient stones unearthed formed into the Queen's English. You can understand me." And the creature's lips peeled back in a way that might have been a smile in some forgotten world. "I have listened to the river of your kind's speech for many years. I have learned the shapes of your words." Each syllable was a labor, a weight lifted from a timeless silence. The wound. I began to voice a question, a fool's hope, but it was silenced by a slow, deliberate shake of its colossal head. "The final page has turned," it rumbled simply. "I am old. This vessel has run its course." It drew a breath that sounded like the turning of a great deep tide. "But I am glad you have come." "Why?" My voice was a ghost of its former self. "Because I have a verse to speak of your kind." Its eyes closed for a moment, a curtain falling to gather strength. And the poem must be heard. I sank to the forest floor, my rifle, that totem of my own small power, forgotten beside me. I was simply an audience before this dying myth. And it was real. And a clarity sharp as winter air pierced the fog of the last 4 years, I was about to be given a truth, a story that would echo long after this moment. The creature's eyes opened again, and in them I saw not just years, but epochs. I saw the silent turning of seasons, a wisdom so profound it made my own 42 years feel like a single, fleeting breath. "Listen," it commanded, and I leaned in, drawn by a gravity older than the mountains. "Listen, and be my memory." The creature, to call it now felt like a sacrilege shifted against the rock, seeking a final comfort. The motion painted a grimace of pain across its features, so heartbreakingly human it cinched a knot in my own chest. "What should I call you?" I asked the question, feeling small against the vastness of the moment. "Do you have a name?" It pondered this, its breath a ragged meter. My people do not wear names like cloaks as yours do, but a pause, a gathering of will. The ones who walked these woods before my time, they spoke of me as the Watcher, for I have done nothing else. I watch. The Watcher, I echoed, and the name settled over the clearing, ancient and fitting. Those deep brown eyes held the silent chronicle of a being who had spent a century in that sacred duty, watching, learning, and bearing witness. I'm James. I offered the introduction, feeling absurdly formal, a calling card presented to a Titan. James. It repeated, and the word sounded softer, more elemental from its lips. You carry the scent of the hunter. Yes, I conceded, but I wasn't hunting you. Just 20 minutes ago I would have sworn your kind was nothing but a story. A flicker, something akin to mournful amusement, sparked in the Watcher's eyes. Most of your kind live within the pages of your own stories. Your disbelief has always been our deepest shadow, our sanctuary. Another tide of breath pulled in and out. But that chapter is closing. Soon I will join the soil. My people are already echoes in the trees. There are others, I pressed. More of you. Few, the Watcher rasped. So very few. Once, in the spring of my youth, the forest knew many of our footfalls. But we are the slow, deep rhythm of the earth. And your kind, you are a wildfire. The words held no anger, only the cold, hard truth of a naturalist's observation which made them pierce all the more deeply. I fumbled for my water bottle and held it out a humble offering. The Watcher regarded it with a scholar's curiosity, then took it with an impossible gentleness, its immense fingers cradling the plastic as if it were a fragile bird's egg. It drank, then returned it with a slow nod. My thanks, it murmured, and the surreality of it all washed over me again. Here I sat in the Washington wilderness, an epilogue written in real time, sharing water with a dying poet from a forgotten race. You said you had a story for me, I prompted softly. A testament about my people. The Watcher nodded a slow, heavy gesture. Yes, I have watched your kind for 102 years. I have watched you bloom, spread and transform. I have witnessed 3 of your grand, terrible wars. I have seen your tools become sorcery and your numbers swell like a river in flood. It paused, and the air grew heavier still. And I have seen the truth of your soul, the one you yourselves are blind to. I leaned forward, a captive audience to this final fateful lecture. This being had witnessed the whole of the 20th century from the quiet throne of the forest. What an incredible perspective. If you could see humanity from the outside, what do you think you'd notice first? Let me know in the comments below. Tell me, I pleaded. The Watcher's gaze drifted to the canopy, the cathedral ceiling of its home. When I was young, your people moved with the pace of horses. Their tools were humble extensions of their hands. The forest could mend the wounds you gave it. Its eyes, ancient and sorrowful, returned to me. I believed you were as we are, creatures who took only what was needed and left the rest to grow. But we're not. I finished for it, the words tasting like ash. No, the Watcher affirmed. There is a hunger in your spirit that is never sated. First, you sought wood for the hearth, a roof against the rain. This the forest understands. Then you craved more for the sake of coin, for that strange god you call economy. The word was a foreign object in its mouth, spoken with clinical detachment. You began to cut faster than the seeds could dream of growing. You weave your hard black rivers everywhere. You exhale a gray plague from your metal beasts that sickens the sky. I felt a defensive fire rise in me, a need to argue for our art, our progress. But I held my tongue. If this creature's words are resonating with you, please share this video. Some stories need to be heard. But in the presence of this dying sage, a sentinel of 100 years, our human squabbles felt like hollow reeds in the wind. I saw the first iron horse crawl into these ancient hills. The Watcher continued, its voice gaining a flicker of strength, a candle lit by memory. Or perhaps it was merely the final surge of life before the long silence. 1917. A clattering, smoke-belching beast. I thought it a sickness upon the land, but soon learned that all your contraptions are born of such fever. You unearth the bones of ages past, set them ablaze, and choke the very sky with their ghosts. It moved a spasm of pain crossing its features. I watched the axemen arrive. At first, a mere handful, then armies of them, and then your screaming metal demons. In the span of my single life, I have witnessed 90% of this ancient cathedral fall. The matriarchs of the wood, those who had tasted 1,000 winters, silenced in a handful of heartbeats. I know, I whispered, and it was a truth etched in my soul. I'd seen the scars, the mountainsides flayed open to the bone. Even as a man of the woods, a hunter who took from its bounty the sheer scale of the ruin always coiled like a snake in my gut. We've lost our way. Too far. The creature echoed the words of final judgment. Yes, but what truly haunts my final moments, what I must impart ere I fade. Its gaze seized mine in urgency so profound it raised the hair on my arms. Your people are not blind. You are aware of the path you tread. I have heard the whispers of your wise men. I have listened to the talking boxes you carry. They speak of a fever gripping the world, of the great ice sweeping into the sea, of the great silence falling over the beasts. They sound the alarm. Climate change, I breathed. Yeah, the scientists are screaming about it now. And yet, the watcher's voice fell to a conspiratorial deathbed whisper. You do not stir. You know the precipice looms. You see the chasm and you press your foot to the floor. A shimmer of moisture gathered in its ancient eyes. Was it weeping for us? That is the terror. Not destruction born of ignorance, but a devastation born of choice. Those words struck me with the force of a physical blow because they were the truest words I'd ever heard. It's a heavy thought, isn't it? If you agree, hit that like button to let me know you're feeling this. We knew. The sirens had been wailing for generations. And still, we marched on consuming building, burning the world's ancient heart and raising its green lungs, all while whispering the liar's prayer that someone else would make it right. My kin, the watcher rasped, we perish because you have stolen our corners of the world, but you're kind. You will perish because you are devouring the world itself. That is the great and terrible paradox. You possess the cleverness to foresee the fall, but lack the wisdom to step back from the edge. I was left in a crushing silence buried beneath the weight of its truth. Before me lay the last of a line that had endured for eons, a people who lived as part of the forest's song, taking only what was needed, a whisper in the leaves, a shadow in the glen. And they were being erased by a species that knew better, a species locked in a frenzy of self-destruction. Is that why you called me here? I asked, my voice tight. To be the herald of our doom. No, it said, and a new note, one of warmth, sounded in its fading voice. I sought you out because you are not like the others. Different how? You carry the ghost of death within you. I see its shadow, I smell its reign. It is not the decay of the body, but the ache of the soul. It is grief. You have held a life as it slipped away, a life you treasured. Its eyes were like ancient pools, deep and knowing. Such a thing unmakes a man and then remakes him. It teaches him the true measure of things. My throat closed. 4 years I hadn't spoken Tommy's name. 4 years of pushing his memory into the deep, quiet places. My best friend, the words escaped me unbidden. Tommy Garcia. He passed in my arms. Yes. The watcher affirmed, its tone a soft balm. You still carry that moment. That weight is your lens. It is what sets you apart. It is what allows you to truly see. See what? That each breath is a jewel, that the hourglass is always emptying, that a life of endless taking is a life of endless emptiness. The watcher drew a ragged breath. Your species is but a child, and like all children you believe yourselves immortal. You stumble and break things because you cannot conceive of a final chapter. But you have shaken hands with the end. You know the last page will turn. I brushed at my eyes, startled by the dampness. So, what am I supposed to do with this knowledge? Remember, the creature said, its simplicity profound. Remember this conversation. Remember the Ancient One who in his 102nd year saw your people sprinting toward the abyss and pleaded with you to change course. This message is powerful, and I think it needs to be heard. If you agree, please consider sharing this video with just one person you think it would resonate with. Its breaths came in shallow tides, now the words trailing like smoke. Be a voice. Plant seeds of thought. Perhaps their roots will not find purchase in time. Perhaps the season for your people to be saved has already passed. But perhaps not. I'm just one man, I argued, the words tasting of ash, a hermit in the pines. I speak to almost no one. Who would ever listen to me? You were a warrior once, the Watcher countered. You understand the nature of a mission of playing your part even when victory is but a sliver of hope. What do you all think? Can one person truly make a difference? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. It unfurled a hand as vast as a boulder, and I let it settle upon my shoulder. The weight was crushing a mountain's pressure, yet it held the tenderness of a father. This quest is now yours, it rumbled. Become the vessel for my words. Go and be my echo. Tell them the Watcher stood his vigil and spoke his warning. Tell them the crossroads is not yet behind them. And with that, the hand slid from my shoulder, a landslide of flesh and bone crashing silently to the earth. The Watcher's breaths became whispers of wind, each one shallower than the last. I was witnessing an eclipse, the ancient starlight in its eyes dimming into twilight. Hold on, I pleaded, a flood of questions rising. Your people, your survival, your story. The hour for questions has passed, the Watcher rasped, cutting through my haste. There is only time for truth, and truth is a simple heavy stone. Its gaze, a final piercing beam, pinned me to my spot. Your species holds symphonies within its soul. I have witnessed your art that weeps, your love that defies death. You are not a blight upon this world, merely children brash, foolish, and shackled by fear. Fear of what? I asked. Of becoming, of shedding the warm, familiar skin of your mistakes. Its voice was now a rustle of dying leaves. But metamorphosis is the only road that leads from this place. Either you rewrite your story on this earth, or the earth will write its own upon you in a language of suffering. In verses of loss, in the final silent chapter of everything you hold dear. Its eyelids, heavy as tombstones, fell shut, then struggled open with a Herculean effort. Give me your vow. It breathed the words like smoke. Promise you will be my memory. Promise you will try. I promise. I choked out my voice, a fractured thing. I swear it. I will remember. I'll try. A calm settled over the Watcher's rugged features, a landscape finally at peace. It is enough. That is all the universe can ask. One soul to hear the song, to understand the verse, to plant a single hopeful seed. When my story is ended. A long, shuddering breath rattled in its chest. I am ready. Ready for the great silence. Can I do anything? I asked, a desperate prayer in my own throat. And to ease your passage. You already have, it murmured, the sound as soft as falling ash. You remained. You heard. You grieved. It is a finer gift than I had dared to hope for. A deeper kindness than your kind often spares. The silence that followed stretched into an eternity. James Mitchell. Thank you for being the vessel of my final testament. Let them be a lantern, not a fire. And so I sat a lone mourner as the tide of its life receded with each fading breath. As the spaces between breaths became vast empty plains, the forest itself seemed to fall silent, a cathedral holding its breath. The ancient trees, in their own slow wisdom, knew a titan was falling. If this moment is hitting you as hard as it did me, do me a favor and hit that like button. It truly helps. Watcher, I whispered into the hallowed quiet. Forgive us. Forgive my people for our trespasses. Forgive us that you had to be a silent witness to the unmaking of your world. I am so sorry you must face this final journey alone, in exile at the end of all things. For one last time its eyes opened, and in their depths I found no storm of anger, no bitter sediment of resentment, but a calm, clear pool that looked like absolution. Not alone, it breathed the sound, a ghost of a voice. You are here, and that is something. In the end, everything is something. And that was the final verse. I watched its great chest rise a final cresting wave-hold for a breathtaking moment, and then stillness. The twin stars in its ancient eyes went out. And the being that had walked this earth for 102 years, a silent observer to the whole of the roaring 20th century, had passed into legend. For an age I just sat there, my hand on its cooling shoulder, a monument of my own grief as tears carved rivers down my face. I had cried precisely once in the 4 years since. Yet we buried Tommy Garcia a brief storm at his funeral before I locked the sorrow away. But now the levees of my soul had shattered, and I wept not only for this fallen giant, but for Tommy, for the dying forests, and for a humanity sprinting with glee towards the abyss, blind to the fall. When at last I rose, my legs were numb, dead weights of flesh and bone. The sun had painted a new story across the sky. Hours had dissolved into this moment. I looked down at the watchers still form a mountain that would soon be reclaimed by the very earth it had trod for more than a century. I could not simply abandon it to the wild. I could not let it be found to become a hunter's boast, a hiker's morbid tale. The watcher would not be a spectacle, a trophy, a grotesque curiosity. This being had charged me with its memory with the weight of its words. The smallest honor I could pay was to grant it a dignified return to dust. The rest of that day's light I spent in labor gathering stones and fallen branches, building a funeral cairn over its body. It was a brutal, aching task, a ritual made harder by the salt and blur of my own unending tears. Yet I did not rest until the last inch of it was hidden from the world. A fleeting monument, I knew, for what is not, but it would shield the watcher long enough for the Great Mother to draw her child back into her embrace. As I set the final stone in its place, I spoke the words into the whispering woods, feeling a fool, but compelled by a force older than reason. I will remember, watcher. I will carry your story. I will try to make them see. I don't know if a single voice can turn the tide, but I will try. And the wind, it sighed through the pines. What do you think? Can one person make a difference? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And for a heartbeat, just one, I let myself believe it was an answer. The journey back down the mountain was an odyssey. Every step was a struggle, my legs filled not with muscle but with lead and memory. And my thoughts, like restless ghosts, were leagues away, replaying the watcher's final soliloquy, the crushing weight of that ancient gaze, the terrible truths spoken on a final fading breath. By the time my boots found the cold steel of my truck, the sun was bleeding across the horizon, a symphony of fire and violet that felt almost like a beautiful lie. The world wore the same face it had at dawn, but the man looking out at it was a stranger. You cannot sit vigil with a dying prophet, a creature who spent a century cataloging our sins against the earth, and walk away unchanged. I drove through the deepening twilight in a fugue state, the truck a faithful beast navigating the familiar roads by instinct as I finally arrived at the small timbered shelter I called home. The darkness was absolute, a perfect void. I sat in the truck for what felt like an eternity, the engine's cooling ticks the only sound in the universe, my eyes fixed upon nothing. Inside the cabin seemed to have shrunk a cloister of shadows. One room holding a bed, a small kitchen alcove, a wood stove for warmth, and shelves lined with books I knew by heart. My life, once a deliberate reduction to essentials, had felt like freedom. Now it just felt like a fortress for a coward. The simple needs for food or sleep were alien desires. Instead, I found myself at my small wooden table, a notebook typically reserved for the quiet secrets of game trails and weather fronts before me, and I began to transcribe the watcher's testament. I wrote down every word I could summon, every subtle inflection, every cavernous pause. My handwriting was a desperate, jagged scrawl, the pen a wild thing struggling to outrun my own chaotic thoughts. By the time I finished, the moon was high and the hour was past midnight. 7 pages were filled with a cramped, frantic script, and it felt as futile as capturing a storm in a bottle. How can mere ink ever hold the gravity of a century's witness? How do you convey the profound sorrow in those ancient eyes? The resignation so terribly intertwined with a desperate, flickering hope. I read what I had written, and then I read it all again, searching for the ghost in the words. The watcher's message was a clarion call, stark and terrifyingly clear. Humanity was racing toward a self-made apocalypse. We knew it, and yet we chose to accelerate, and I, a broken soldier hiding in the woods, was now somehow tasked with making the world care. It felt like being asked to hold back the ocean with a sieve. I was just one man, and not a particularly whole one at that. I had spent the last 4 years building a wall against the world, pushing away any connection that dared to form. What grim irony led the Watcher to believe I could become a messenger to the very people I had fled. But I had given my word. And if 20 years of service taught me a single thing, it was that you honor your promises, especially those made to the dying. If you believe in the power of a promise, hit that like button to show your support. The next morning, I pointed my truck toward Pine Ridge. The town was a small outpost of maybe 800 people, most of them loggers, their lives entwined with the fate of the forest. Or they labored in the few small businesses that served the logging trade. My usual foray into town was a quick surgical strike sell meat to Frank Thompson at the butcher shop, grab my supplies, and retreat back into the green silence. Today, however, I parked directly in front of the Pine Ridge Public Library. The librarian, a woman in her 60s named Dorothy Williams, glanced up, her expression a book of pleasant surprise. I had crossed her threshold maybe twice in 4 years, both times to do battle with the photocopier. "James Mitchell," she said, her voice possessed of a genuine warmth. "What brings you to our quiet corner of the world today?" "I need to do some research," I answered, feeling like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. "About climate change, environmental science, that sort of thing." Dorothy's eyebrows arched with gentle curiosity, but she asked no further questions. Like a guide into a forgotten tomb, she led me to a section near the back, pulling down various books and periodicals. "We don't have an extensive collection, but these should be a starting point on your journey," she offered. "Are you looking for anything in particular?" "Just trying to understand the scope of it, I guess. You know how bad things really are, what the scientists are actually saying behind all the noise." She studied me for a moment, a knowing look in her eyes, then nodded. "I'll leave you to it. Just let me know if you need help navigating the wilderness." For the next 4 hours, I waded through a river of grim facts, poring over reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reading chilling texts about deforestation rates, the great dying of species, the souring of the seas, and apocalyptic projections of rising temperatures, drowned coastlines, and the total collapse of the world as we know it. The more I read, the more the Watcher's words became a terrifying gospel. The science was a chorus of undeniable truth. The warnings were everywhere, and yet the roar of a logging truck still rattled the library windows every single hour. The parking lot was filled with gas-guzzling pickups, monuments to our blissful ignorance. Life just went on as if the cliff's edge wasn't rushing to meet us. Have you ever felt like you're the only one seeing the writing on the wall? Let me know in the comments. Around noon, Dorothy materialized at my table with a cup of coffee and a sandwich she'd clearly fetched from the Mountain View diner next door. "You've been wrestling with those pages for hours," she said gently. "I thought you might need some fuel for the fight." "Thank you," I said, genuinely moved by the small kindness. "You really didn't have to do that." "I know," she interjected with a warm, knowing smile. "But you look like a man on a mission, and every mission requires sustenance." She hesitated for a brief moment, then asked, "What sparked this sudden crusade, if you don't mind an old librarian asking?" I weighed the poet's choice to weave a comforting lie, to deflect with a shield of vagueness, or to speak a stark truth. Instead, a voice I barely recognized as my own said, "I saw something in the heart of the woods yesterday. Something that awakened me as if from a long slumber to the symphony I had been ignoring." Dorothy Williams, with a librarian's quiet grace, pulled up a chair. "I know that feeling, as if the world has come into focus for the first time. For 30 years, I was a teacher in Seattle, a sower of seeds before I came here to rest. I watched generations of children trade the forest for the screen, their wonder lost in the glow of televisions and video games. I witnessed the curriculum like a careless woodsman chop away the science of our own world. We became so consumed by the hymns of commerce that we forgot we are but a single verse in nature's grand poem." "Do you think people can truly change?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I mean truly transform, not just talk of new leaves, but grow them. What do you guys think? Is real change possible? Let me know in the comments below." "Some can." Dorothy Williams mused, her eyes distant. But most will not. Not until the flood is at their doorstep. We humans have a tragic gift for ignoring the coming storm until the thunder breaks the windows. She paused, letting the silence speak. But that doesn't mean the effort is wasted. Every single person who awakens, who sees the world with new eyes and chooses a different path, that is a poem in itself. It matters, even if it feels like a single drop in a boundless ocean. If that resonates with you, hit the like button. The watcher spoke of something similar. I muttered the words, escaping before I could catch them. The watcher, Dorothy Williams, echoed her curiosity, a gentle probe. Someone I met, I said, retreating quickly. Someone ancient, and wise as the mountains. They shared truths I desperately needed to hear. She did not press her wisdom showing in her restraint. She simply nodded. Well, I am glad you are here. To read, to learn to think. That is a pilgrimage most people never begin. She rose, a figure of quiet strength. Take all the time you need. Our doors are open until 6. After she vanished into the stacks, I returned to my quest, filling the pages of my notebook with the ink of revelation. By the time I walked out into the fading light, the true scale of the crisis we faced was etched onto my soul, a terrifying map of a future rushing toward us with very little time to alter its course. In the week that followed, my life found a new rhythm. Mornings were for the body, the hunt, the work of my hands, the maintenance of my small fortress of solitude. Afternoons were for the mind, spent in the hallowed silence of the library. I consumed every text I could find on the wounds of our world. Evenings were for wrestling with ghosts, trying to translate the Watcher's profound, earth-shattering message into a language that a deaf world might finally hear. The terrible irony was I had forgotten how to speak that language myself. 4 years of silence had turned my social skills to rust, leaving me a stranger among my own kind. And, honestly, who would lend an ear to a reclusive former soldier, a man haunted by the woods, rambling about prophecies from a creature born of myth and shadow? On the 8th day since the Watcher's passing, while I was at the butcher shop, a simple question from Frank Thompson acted as the key that would unlock my future. "James, you know your way around tracking, don't you?" He asked, his hands expertly wrapping the venison. "I know some," I replied, a carefully measured understatement. I knew more than some. I could read the land like a sacred text, a skill honed in places I'd rather forget, but it was a chapter of my life I kept closed. My nephew's Boy Scout troop needs someone to teach them the language of the wilderness, Frank explained. How to read tracks, the basics of survival, things like that. The man who used to do it moved on. You were the first person I thought of. Every instinct, every nerve forged in isolation screamed at me to refuse, to retreat back into my fortress of trees, to avoid the entanglement of people, and especially the bright, questioning eyes of children. But then, I saw a shadow of a giant in my mind's eye, and I remembered a solemn promise made to the earth itself. "When?" The word left my mouth before I could stop it. Frank's face bloomed with surprise. "For real? You'd be willing? They gather on Saturday mornings at the Pine Ridge Community Center. I can give you the Scoutmaster's phone number." "Okay," I agreed, a storm of anxiety gathering in my chest even as I spoke the words. "Yes, I'll do it." And so that Saturday I stood before 12 boys aged between 11 and 14, a small jury staring at me with that potent blend of youthful curiosity and feigned indifference. Their scoutmaster, a kind-faced man named Kevin Anderson, had introduced me as an experienced outdoorsman who has graciously agreed to share some of his advanced knowledge with you. I'd been a stranger to sleep the night before my mind, a stage where I endlessly rehearsed my lines, battling the powerful urge to flee back to the silence of the woods. I was no longer a man of words or people. I was certainly not a teacher of children. What madness had I agreed to? But a promise is a sacred debt. "My name is James Mitchell," I began, my voice a rough, unused thing like stones grinding together. "I'm going to teach you how to read the stories written in the dirt, how to follow the ghosts of animals, how to move without a sound, and how to see the world that hides in plain sight from most people." A hand shot up instantly. "Did you ever track something really dangerous like a bear or a mountain lion?" "Yes," I said, the single word hanging in the air. Then an impulse I couldn't control made me add, "and something else," something most people have stopped believing in. That snared their attention. 12 pairs of eyes, now sharp and bright, locked onto me. "What was it?" another boy asked, his voice filled with breathless eagerness. I paused, the weight of the Watcher's legacy settling on me. This was not the beginning I had planned, but perhaps it was the one I was fated to have. Children, after all, have not yet learned to build walls against the impossible. If you want to hear what I told them, make sure you share this story and subscribe for the next chapter. Their minds were still open fields, not yet enclosed by the cynical fences that adults wear like a shroud. Before I share this story, I began, my voice low, I need you to grasp a truth. This wilderness, this cathedral of trees, is not merely a stage for our fleeting dramas or a pantry for our appetites. It is a home, an ancient home, to beings who walked this earth long before our first cities rose, and their right to exist is a song as old as the mountains themselves. And now we are silencing that song. We are unraveling the very tapestry of their home, poisoning the air they breathe and the water they drink, twisting the seasons themselves. We move with such a brutal, relentless speed that they have no time to learn a new way to live. I saw in their eyes a flicker of wonder warring with confusion. Kevin Anderson watched me as gaze, a careful measure, no doubt trying to chart the course of this strange lecture. Last week, I went on, I followed a whisper deep into the mountains, a legend I never dared believe, and I found it breathing its last. It was not the gentle hand of time that brought it low, but the grief of a lost home, of having no corner of the world left that was safe from the thunder of our machines. What was it? The first boy pressed his body, leaning in as if pulled by a current. Your world calls it Bigfoot, I said softly. I came to know it as the Watcher, and before it passed it shared a truth about humanity that this world desperately needs to hear. A truth, especially for you, because you are the ones who will inherit the dawn or the dusk that we are creating. A silence fell upon the room, thick and heavy as a forest mist. Even Kevin Anderson leaned forward, his face a canvas of skepticism and fascination. The Watcher, I said, had seen 102 winters. It had witnessed the entire 20th century bloom and burn, watching us evolve from horse-drawn plows to cars, from axes to the iron teeth of chainsaws and factories that exhale shadows into the sky. And do you know the terror that haunted it most? Not that we are destroying our world by accident, but that we do so with our eyes wide open, seeing the cliff's edge, and still we floor the accelerator. If that chilling thought hits home, do me a favor and tap that like button. A scoff sliced through the quiet. One of the older boys spoke, his voice laced with challenge. You're seriously expecting us to buy that you met Bigfoot? I don't care if you believe in the messenger, I replied with stark honesty. What matters is the message. Whether it came from a myth, a dying prophet, or a voice in a dream, the truth it carries does not change. We are in the final chapter of a story we can't afford to finish, and you, every one of you, will have to live with the consequences of the ink my generation has spilled. I pulled forth my journal, its pages filled with the ghost of the Watcher's words and my own frantic research. I'm going to teach you how to track and survive just as I promised. But I will also teach you something far more vital, how to see the forest not as a collection of things but as a single, breathing soul. How to understand the elegy of what we're losing, and maybe, just maybe, how to become the generation that finally grabs the wheel and turns this car around. Share this video if you believe they can be that generation. The boys sat in a charged silence, the weight of my words settling upon them. Then a small hand belonging to a boy of maybe 11 years rose tentatively into the air. Yes, I prompted. If Bigfoot was real, he asked, his voice full of a child's profound gravity, and it saw everything, what did it want? Did it have like a final wish? A knot tightened in my throat. Yes, I answered. It said that humans are not evil, but simply young, and afraid, terrified of change, of admitting we were wrong, of letting go of the comforts that are costing us everything. But it also spoke of a greatness sleeping within us, a capacity for a love so vast it can move mountains, and for the courage to choose a different path. It asked me to be its memory, to tell its story so that someone somewhere might wake up in time. The boy nodded, absorbing the tale with a solemnity that made my own heart ache. What's one small change you could make to honor that message? Let me know in the comments below. Kids, they still possess that sacred open space, the ability to hear truth without the bitter armor of cynicism. My voice found its strength again, ringing out, "So, who wants to learn to read the forest's secret alphabet?" Every single hand shot into the air, and so the tracking lessons became our weekly ritual. Each Saturday morning I'd meet the Boy Scout troop for our pilgrimage into the wild. We would convene in the woods that whispered behind the Pine Ridge Community Center, or venture out to other sacred spots around Pine Ridge. I taught them to decipher the stories written in mud. I taught them to read the histories told by scat and the scars upon trees and how to walk as a whisper through the woods. But beyond that, I taught them the poetry of the ecosystem, the invisible threads that bind it all together. I showed them how the wound of a clear-cut far upstream could make the river sick miles away, and told them the quiet tragedies of species vanishing from these hills not with a roar, but with the silence of a final footprint. Of course, not every seed I planted took root. A few of the boys surely thought I was a rambling old fool, especially after that first day's sermon on the Watcher. But a core fellowship of about 5 or 6 of them kept returning their hunger for knowledge, a bright, burning thing that warmed the Saturday air. One of this fellowship was Ryan Martinez, a 13-year-old small for his age, but with a mind as sharp and clear as a shard of obsidian. After our third session, he waited behind as the other boys' voices faded with the sound of their parents' cars. Mr. Mitchell, he began, his voice a fragile thing. I've been wrestling with the words you spoke of the Watcher and this ruin we seem to be writing upon the world. I hear you, I replied, my hands gathering the tools of my trade. My father, Ryan went on, his voice sinking to a conspiratorial whisper, he works for Olympic Timber. He's a feller, one of the men who brings the great trees down. Just last week I heard him with his friends, their words laced with fear about the greens who want to silence their saws to steal the very bread from their tables. But... He trailed off, a war raging behind his young eyes. When you unveil the symphony, we're silencing the beauty, we're turning to dust. I can't help but ask, what if those people are speaking a difficult truth? Does that make me a traitor to my own father? My hands fell still. I turned and met his gaze, holding it fast. In that moment I saw it. This was the very crossroads. The precipice the Watcher had described. A fulcrum point where a soul either chooses the dawn of awareness or slips back into the comfortable twilight of slumber. No, I said, my voice a bedrock. It makes you a man who dares to forge his own conscience. Your father is not the villain in this story for wielding an axe. He is a man bound by duty to his kin. But the cold, unfeeling machine that offers him such a cruel bargain, and a choice between the food on his table and the lifeblood of the woods that is the great fracture in our world. Then what is our part to play? Ryan pleaded, his voice cracking with the weight of it all. If you've ever felt trapped by a choice like this, smash that like button. Silence the saws and families starve. Let them roar and the forest bleeds out. It's a wound no matter which way we turn. And that, I said, is the devil's bargain. The poisoned chalice we've been forced to drink from for generations. This notion that it must be all or nothing, man's prosperity versus nature's soul. The Watcher revealed to me the lie in that equation. The truer question is this: can we compose a life that doesn't require a funeral pyre for the world? Can we learn to harvest with a gentle hand, taking only what the forest offers freely? Can we forge new livelihoods, not from ruin, but from restoration? From healing the scars we've made. Is such a world possible? Ryan breathed. I don't have the map, I confessed, but I know in my bones we must seek that new country. Because the road we now travel, it leads only to a shared desolation. A silent world with no work for human hands and no shelter for the wild. Ryan nodded, the gears of a new understanding turning within him. Will you share more of its wisdom? The visions it granted you, and the path you believe we must walk? Yes, I affirmed. Yes, I can do that. In a small town, a story travels like wildfire on the wind. The tale of the mountain recluse who spoke with a forest giant, now guiding the town's youth through the pages of nature's own book. The town's response was a river of conflicting currents. For Frank Thompson, it was a revelation. A seed of wild curiosity had sprouted in his nephew, who now dreamt of becoming a guardian of the wilderness. Dorothy Williams, a kindred spirit, began to grace our gatherings, her arms laden with books and articles weaving new threads of knowledge into my lessons. Kevin Anderson, the scoutmaster, walked a careful line of support, though I saw the strain in his face from parrying the worried questions of concerned parents. But with the support came a chilling frost. I began to feel the weight of stares and the street looks that branded me agitator, dreamer, or words far less kind. Voices sharp as splinters would remind me that the forest's fall is what fills their plates. They suggested I remember that before poisoning the well of the next generation with my fables. This simmering pot of resentment finally boiled over about 3 weeks after my first lesson. At the Mountain View Diner. My challenger was Steve Johnson, a supervisor for the timber company. A mountain of a man with a face flushed with rage and fists that looked like they could shatter stone. He trapped me in my booth just as I was taking my last bite of breakfast. "You're Mitchell," he barked, his voice a clap of thunder that silenced the diner's gentle hum. "I am," I replied, staying seated, my voice a calm river against his storm. This was not the first time I'd faced a man's fury. "You're the one filling our children's heads with poison." Steve accused, his shadow falling over me, painting us as villains for earning an honest wage. "I have never used the word evil," I countered, keeping my tone level. "I said that our choices have echoes, that our actions have a cost. There is a world of difference in that." "Rhetoric," Steve sneered. "You're peddling lies to turn our own children against us. My son, my own boy, came home and asked me if his father was a murderer of the world. He is 12 years old, and you put that darkness in his heart." Every eye in the diner was a needle pointed at my skin. This was a town built on timber. These were the people whose lives were entwined with the fate of the forest, and I was on trial before them all. I was a stranger in the strange land. "I grieve that your son carries that burden," I said, choosing my words as if walking on glass. "But perhaps the question is not why I spoke, but why the truth itself lands with such a heavy blow. What do you think of that response? Let me know in the comments below. The facts are a stark and simple poem, Steve. We are taking more than the earth can give. That isn't a story I'm telling. It's simple arithmetic. Science." Steve scoffed the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. "Let me tell you what I know. I know the grain of this wood and the scent of this soil. I have walked these woods for 20 years. I know my craft. I know we put saplings in the ground, that we follow the letter of the law. We are not the monsters of your bedtime stories." "I know you replant," I acknowledged softly, "but a garden of soldiers is not the same as a living, breathing forest. It's a field of wooden stalks, a ghost of a forest. It cannot sing with the same chorus of life, nor can it hold the breath of the world in its soil. It fails to offer the sacred communion that a true ancient forest provides." A storm gathered in Steve's face, the color of a furious sunset. "You think you're some kind of prophet strutting in here with your leather-bound words and your $10 vocabulary. But I see you for what you're, a broken soldier playing dress-up in a classroom. You've never known the grit of real work under your fingernails, the weight of a family on your shoulders, or the simple brutal truth of what it takes to carve out a life in this world." A winter bloomed in my chest, cold and sharp. "I know about survival," I whispered the words like ghosts. "I have walked through valleys of shadow you can't even conjure in your nightmares." I held my best friend's life in my hands as it slipped away, staining the jungle floor red, all because my legs weren't strong enough. And his last breath, his last words to me were a testament. He said, "Make it count, James. Don't let the time you have left be for nothing. Make it mean something." I rose to my feet, the food on my plate turning to ash in my mind. For 4 years, I became a hermit, a ghost in the woods, telling myself I was a chapter that had already ended, finished with the tapestry of humanity, done with the very notion of making a difference. Then, I met a being, an ancient consciousness that had watched our kind for a full century, and it held up a mirror to us, revealing a long, slow march toward our own undoing. A tragedy we are either too sightless to see or too cowardly to name. The clatter and hum of the Mountain View diner died away, replaced by a silence as thick as dust on a forgotten book. Steve Johnson's gaze was fixed on me. The fire of his rage now banked embers of something else glowing in its place, doubt perhaps, or a flicker of recognition. So, yes, I continued, my voice finding its strength. I'm teaching children to see the world not as a blur, but with the clarity of a hawk on the wing, to feel the ache of what is vanishing from our grasp, to become, if we are lucky, the generation that turns from our well-worn road to ruin and blazes a new trail. And if that earns me the title of troublemaker in your ledger, then I will wear that name with honor. For I would rather be a fool who tilted at windmills than a wise man who let the world burn. I laid some bills on the counter and walked into the morning air, my hands shaking with the storm that had just passed through me. Behind me, the diner slowly came back to life, a low murmur like a waking giant, but I did not look back. That afternoon, the mountain called to me, and I hiked the familiar path to the Watcher's Memorial, a pilgrimage I now made every few days. My ritual was simple: to ensure the stones rested in peace, to stand in the profound silence of that place, and to weave myself back into the fabric of the promise I had sworn to keep. But as I approached the clearing, I saw I was not alone. A figure sat near the stone, still as the mountain itself, an elder, a Native American woman, her face a beautiful map of years, her eyes closed in meditation. She wore the regalia of her people, and her hair, a river of silver, was braided down her back. I paused at the edge of the trees, a traveler, unsure if he was welcome in this sacred space. Then, as if she had heard the whisper of my thoughts, her eyes opened. They found me instantly, her gaze deep and knowing. "You are the one who raised these stones," she said, her voice the sound of wind through ancient pines. It was not a question, but a fact. "I am," I answered, my voice hushed. I found a life that had ended here, and felt it deserved a measure of dignity. Her eyes held me for a long, quiet moment, as if reading the pages of my soul. "I am called Mary Running Deer. My people are the Klamath," she said. "This earth you stand on is the cradle of our ancestors, a truth your government's maps have long tried to erase." She motioned with a graceful hand toward the pile of stones. "You have consecrated this ground. It was a good and honorable act to mark the passing of one of the old ones." A drum began to beat wildly in my chest. "You know," I asked, my breath catching, "you know what it was I found here? Our stories have always held the forest people." Mary said, her tone as simple and deep as the earth. "We call them the Sasquatch. They were the first walkers of this land, and their spirits will remain when our own have become dust. Or so the stories told." She amended, a shadow crossing her face, "before your people came and bled the land dry." She rose from the earth with a grace that defied her years, fluid as smoke. "News travels on the wind among my people. We heard the story that a man from your world found an old one at the end of its journey, that he did not flee but sat vigil, that he listened and honored its body. This is not the common tale. Usually your kind meets the unknown with either terror or a rifle." "It gave me a charge," I said, the memory still raw, "to be a vessel for its memory, to carry its warning about our species and the crossroads at which we stand." "And are you a faithful vessel?" Mary's question was a gentle probe into my soul. "Are you carrying its words?" "I am trying," I confessed. "Teaching the children, reading, learning. Just trying to solve the impossible riddle of how one soul can turn a tide so vast. What do, when the great machine of the world seems built only to grind forward, deaf to any plea?" Mary nodded, a slow, patient motion. "You are wrestling with the wrong question. The question is not how one person can remake the world. The question is, what is my role in the great story? You are not called to carry the entire world upon your shoulders, James Mitchell. You are only called to play your part." "That is what the Watcher told me," I whispered, the parallel striking me. "It spoke of planting seeds, but I am a clumsy gardener, uncertain if my seeds are sown in fertile ground, if they will ever sprout, or if the long winter is already upon us." "There is never enough time," Mary affirmed, her voice steady, "and certainty is a luxury we are never afforded. but that does not absolve us of the duty to try." She reached into a small leather pouch at her side, her fingers closing around something wrapped in soft cloth. "I have brought an offering for the old one." With reverent hands she unwrapped the cloth, revealing a pendant of dark polished wood intricately carved and suspended from a simple leather thong. It was a perfect circle, etched with symbols that spoke a language my eyes did not know. "In the way of my people," she explained, "this is a prayer for a safe passage into the great mystery." She then, gently laid it to rest upon the highest stone of the memorial, uttering words in a language that was a stranger to my ears. When her prayer was done, she turned to me. "The Ancient Ones are passing James Mitchell, not from the mere passage of time, but from a grief too heavy to bear, from witnessing the world they knew vanish like a dream upon waking. But before their light fades, some are whispering their last testaments to people like you, people with hearts quiet enough to listen. You are not the first to hear this call, and you will not be the last, but you may be one of the few who transforms their words into deeds." "What is it I must do?" I asked, the desperation a raw note in my own voice. "Exactly what you have begun," Mary said softly. "You must teach, speak the truth, plant seeds of hope, and connect with the others who are tending their own gardens of change. And believe me, there are more of us than you know. My people, we have fought this very battle for 500 years. We've lost more ground than we've held, but we fight on because what else is there to do? Surrender. Let them erase everything without a single soul left to bear witness." She laid a hand upon my shoulder, and I felt a profound, comforting warmth spread from her touch. "The Old One chose a worthy vessel. You are broken enough to understand loss, strong enough to carry this burden, and stubborn enough to never surrender when the trials come. Those are the qualities that truly matter." "I am afraid," I admitted the confession, feeling like a stone lifted from my chest. "Afraid I will fail them. Afraid it is already far too late." "Of course you are afraid," Mary replied, her gaze unwavering. "Anyone with sense is afraid, but courage isn't a world without fear. It is taking action in spite of it. It's finding your footing even when the world is shaking. It's planting a forest even if you know you will never sit in its shade." She began to walk away, then paused. "There is a council next month. Environmental groups, tribal leaders, scientists, activists. They are gathering to stand against a new wound planned for the Olympic Mountains. You need to be there. Bring your story. Let others hear the Old One's final song." "I don't know if they will believe me," I said. A wise smile graced Mary's face. "Some will, and some will not. But the ones who need to hear it will be listening with their souls. And they are all that matters." She gave me an address and a date. "The Old One's words cannot be a secret kept in your notebook. If you believe stories like this need to be shared, please consider passing this one along. They are seeds that must be spoken, shared, and planted in as many minds as possible." After she departed, I sat by the cairn for a long time, meditating on her words, on playing my small part on courage being a verb, and on the invisible network of souls already on the front lines, already fighting for a better dawn. The Watcher had seen truly. Humanity did possess a capacity for greatness. I had seen it in Ryan Martinez as he questioned his own truths, and in Dorothy Williams as she shared her wisdom, in Mary Running Deer as she kept the sacred traditions breathing, and in the quiet resolve of the boys who came every Saturday, undeterred by their friends calling them tree huggers. The seeds were indeed being planted, slowly, silently taking root in one heart at a time. Perhaps they would grow fast enough, perhaps not. But I had given my word to try. As I stood to leave, I placed my hand on the stone cairn one last time. "I am doing my part, Watcher," I said to the silence. "I pray it will be enough." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of cedar and earth, a benediction, and I chose to hear it as an answer. The gathering Mary had spoken of was held in a community hall in Tacoma, roughly a 2-hour drive from the quiet of Pine Ridge. I almost turned back. The morning of the event, I sat in my truck for 20 long minutes, my hands strangling the steering wheel, while every fiber of my being screamed at me to retreat, to go home. For 4 years, I had meticulously avoided this very scene, rooms full of people, the expectation of conversation, of connection. The thought of standing before strangers to recite the Watcher's story made my chest seize with a familiar anxiety. But I had made a promise to a dying being that had seen 102 years circle the sun. My own discomfort felt laughably small in comparison. The hall was larger than I'd anticipated. Perhaps 100 people were scattered like fallen leaves among the rows of folding chairs. I recognized the archetypes instantly. The environmental activists in their worn flannel and hiking boots, tribal representatives dressed in a blend of traditional and modern attire, academics with their briefcases and folders full of data, and a handful of journalists with their cameras and recorders. Mary found me almost at once appearing at my elbow as I hovered awkwardly near the back. "You came," she said, and the genuine warmth in her voice was a balm. "I wasn't sure you would." "I promised," I said the word, feeling solid and real. "Good." She guided me toward a group of people near the front. "There are some folks I want you to meet." Over the next hour, I felt as if I was being introduced to an entire movement. Dr. Susan Parker, a wildlife biologist from Oregon State, who had spent her career documenting the heartbreaking decline of species in the Olympic Mountains. Then John Clearwater, a Warm Springs tribal elder who had fought the expansion of logging for decades. And there, as fate would have it, was Jennifer Williams Dorothy's own daughter, a champion for the Sierra Club, surrounded by a fellowship of journalists, activists, and scientists, all soldiers in the silent war the Watcher had so eloquently described. What haunted me, though, was the profound weariness etched onto their faces, a fatigue that ran deeper than bone and muscle, settling like a fine dust upon their very souls. These were the veterans of an unseen battle. People who had stood their ground for years, even decades, only to see their small, hard-won victories swallowed by the relentless tide of defeat. I saw in their gaze the ghost of the Watcher's eyes, that ancient, hollowing exhaustion that comes from watching something precious and irreplaceable slip through your fingers, despite all your strength. As the clock struck 10, a hush fell, and the formal program began a litany of data on deforestation, extinction, and the ever-warming climate. The numbers were a gut punch far worse than the cold truths I'd uncovered in the library's quiet stacks. The great Olympic Mountains, those sleeping giants, were shedding their old-growth forests at a terrifying speed, a critical sanctuary for the spotted owls, for the marbled murrelets and the Pacific fishers, a home to dozens of species being fractured beyond any hope of mending, while the carbon stored for an age in ancient wood was being exhaled like a final dying breath into an already feverish sky. Yet, from this despair, there was talk of defiance, of legal battles being waged, of direct action campaigns blooming like wildflowers in a clear cut, and of sustainable alternatives being forged. These people, bless them, had not surrendered. If you admire that kind of resilience, tap that like button. During the quiet interlude of lunch, Mary Running Deer found me once more. "This afternoon," she began, her voice low and certain, "we have an open mic, a space for people to share the poetry of their purpose, their reason for being here. I believe you should speak." My own anxiety, a serpent in my gut, began to stir. "I don't know," I stammered. "I'm no orator, and this whole Sasquatch saga. They'll write me off as a madman." "Some will," she conceded with a wise calm, "but others will listen. James, look at these souls. They are weary travelers. They've been on this long road with so little to show for their journey. They need a story to remind them of the sunrise, of why they first set out. They need to hear that this fight isn't for statistics and policies, but for living hearts, for real lives, and for a loss that echoes through the generations." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "The Watcher's tale could be the water their spirits are thirsting for, the strength they need to continue the pilgrimage." I heard the Watcher's voice, then a whisper about planting seeds, about playing my small part in the great turning. "All right," I breathed the words of promise. "I will try. What do you think? Was this the right decision? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments." When the session began, I listened as others offered their testimonies. First, a young woman, a veteran of the treetops who had been arrested for her protest. Then an old farmer spoke, his voice cracking, of how the shifting skies were turning his legacy to dust. A Native American youth described the sacred wound of watching holy sites bulldozed for logging roads. Each story was a thread weaving together with the last, creating a vast and somber tapestry of a world under siege and of the desperate love of those trying to hold it together. Finally, the moment arrived, carried on the air by Merry Running Deer's voice. James Mitchell from Pine Ridge. He has a story that longs to be heard. I walked to the front on legs of lead, feeling the gravity of 100 pairs of eyes, a weight far heavier than any enemy fire I had ever faced on the battlefield. In the theater of war, at least, you know the face of your enemy. My name is James Mitchell. I began, my voice a rougher echo than I'd intended. 6 weeks ago, Bigfoot was just a myth to me. In truth, almost everything was a myth to me then. I was a ghost in my own life, a hermit in the woods, a refugee from humanity trying to muffle the loud thoughts in my own head. I drew out my notebook, its pages soft and worn like an old scripture. Then I stumbled upon tracks, colossal prints that belonged to no known beast. I followed them, and I found a being. A creature of myth made flesh, standing over 7 feet tall, cloaked in reddish-brown hair with eyes that held a universe of intelligence I have rarely seen in my own kind. A current rippled through the room, a murmur of skepticism, of curiosity, perhaps even of ridicule. But I pressed on for him. He was dying. Not just from a grievous wound, but from the simple weight of his years. 102 years old. He told me he was a silent witness to the entire 20th century, watching our world from the deep shadows of these very woods. And before he crossed over, he charged me with a sacred task to remember his testament, to be a vessel for his words, and carry them to those who might still have ears to hear. My hands trembled, but I opened the notebook and began to read. I read the Watcher's elegy, his lament for the disappearing forests, his vision of humanity as a species sprinting with eyes wide open towards the edge of a great cliff. I spoke of the most terrible truth he shared, that this devastation we are causing is not some tragic, unforeseen accident, but the consequence of our own deliberate choice. He called us young, I continued, finally looking up from the hallowed pages. A young species, he said, still learning, still making the most terrible and beautiful mistakes. But he also spoke of a greatness sleeping within us, a boundless capacity for love, for sacrifice, for a profound and radical change. He asked me no, he begged me to plant seeds, to tell others, to perhaps help a single soul awaken before the final twilight descends. If this story reached you, please share it with someone else. Let's help plant those seeds together. A profound silence fell upon the room, a space where I could read the landscape of their faces. Some were spellbound. Others shifted uneasy in their seats, while a few clearly saw me as a man lost in his own fables. I said, echoing the words I'd spoken to the Boy Scouts. Whether you believe in the creature is beside the point. What matters is the message, the final will and testament. We are living on borrowed time. The great forests are breathing their last. The climate itself is in a fever. Entire symphonies of life are going quiet, and we know it. God help us, we know it. But we carry on as if some other hero from some other story will arrive to save us. As if we can afford to worry about it later. As if the economy or jobs or simple convenience could ever hold a candle to the very soul of this planet, our only home. I closed the notebook its purpose served. The Watcher died alone on a mountainside, the last of its ancient line in these mountains. It spent a century as a silent witness to the dismantling of its world. And with its final breath, it tried to warn us that we are dismantling our own. That is what brought me to this place. That is why I am standing before you strangers telling a story that makes me sound like a madman. Because I made a sacred promise to a dying being that I would carry this message forward. My eyes swept the room, meeting as many gazes as I could. We are all here because we are trying to do our part fighting these noble battles in courtrooms. Chronicling the last of a species, protecting sacred ground, teaching our children writing words we hope will catch fire. I know it feels hopeless at times. It feels like we are shouting into a hurricane. By the way, if you've ever felt that way, let me know in the comments what keeps you going. But the Watcher spent 102 years in its vigil watching and hoping. It never gave up. So, how can we? I returned to my seat, my legs unsteady, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The silence stretched on for a long moment, a held breath, and then a single person began to clap. Then another joined, and then more until the sound rose like a wave through the room. Not everyone, though. I could still see skepticism etched on some faces. Some were clearly dismissing my story as a mere metaphor, but enough of them felt the truth in it to make a difference. After the session, a current of people began to flow my way. Some wanted the raw facts where I had founded a sketch of its form if I had any proof. I told them its resting place would remain a secret, a hallowed ground deserving of its peace. As for proof, I had only my word and the ink in my notebook, and that would have to be enough. But there were others who understood. They knew that the details of the messenger mattered far less than the message itself. Dr. Susan Parker spoke to me about the species she was documenting, about how she sometimes felt she was merely an archivist of extinctions, not a preventer of them. "Your story reminded me why I started," she said, her voice a quiet reverence. "Not for the data or the publications, but because these creatures matter. Their lives are poems. Thank you for that." John Clearwater pulled me aside and told me stories woven into his own tradition about the forest people of how his grandfather had met one as a boy and was taught the great rhythm of living in balance. "The old ones are dying," he said, his words a solemn echo of Mary's. "But they're trying to teach us before they go. It's heartening to see that some of us are still listening." Even a few of the skeptics approached not to mock, but to engage in earnest. A journalist asked thoughtful questions about how my military past informed my perspective on this new kind of battlefield. An activist wanted to know if I'd be willing to share my story at other gatherings to help build a tide of momentum for the legal challenges they were mounting. "If you believe this story needs to be heard, please share this video." By the time I left, I held a folder filled with battle plans and HOPE contact information, upcoming events, research papers, and strategic outlines. I also had something less tangible but far more precious, the profound sense that I was not a lone voice in the wilderness, that there was a whole chorus of people fighting the same fight, planting the same seeds, holding on to a stubborn hope against the longest of odds. The drive back to Pine Ridge felt entirely different than the drive there. I had left my cabin that morning feeling like an island, isolated and uncertain. I returned feeling part of a continent. When I got home, there were 3 messages waiting on the answering machine I barely used. The first, from Dorothy Williams, letting me know that Ryan Martinez's father wanted to talk to me. The second, Jennifer Williams saying she had been at the gathering and wanted to discuss bringing an environmental education program to Pine Ridge. And the third, Mary Running Deer, her voice simple and true, saying, "You did good, James." The old one would be proud. I made coffee and sat at my table surrounded by the papers I'd gathered. These weren't just documents. They were scriptures of a movement, plans for legal challenges to the expansion of logging, proposals for sustainable forestry alternatives like new hymns for the woods, educational programs being forged, networks of activists, scientists, and indigenous leaders all coordinating their efforts. The feeling was overwhelming, but in a completely different key than before. It wasn't the crippling paralysis of one man facing an insurmountable mountain, but the awesome power of a rising river. I saw not a simple task, but the intricate poetry of a community striving together for something monumental, yet within reach. For the next few weeks, I became a vessel for the work. I continued my lessons with the Boy Scouts, letting our curriculum bloom to embrace the vast cathedral of the environment. My voice soon found its way into town council meeting, where I advocated for the wildlands armed with the stark verses of data and research. I joined forces with Jennifer Williams to sow new ideas in local schools, weathering the predictable gales of pushback from some parents. Yet, in the most unlikely chapter of this tale, I arranged a parley with Steve Johnson, the very timber supervisor who had once stood as my antagonist at the Mountain View Diner. As fate would have it, his own son was one of my scouts, and the boy had begun bringing home questions that echoed with the weight of falling trees. Steve had come intending to command my retreat, but instead we found ourselves lost in a 3-hour communion on sustainable forestry, charting how the current system was a slow poison to both the ancient woods and the logger's future. My grandfather was a logger. Steve's voice was a low murmur over coffee at his kitchen table. He walked the same forest for 40 years, a careful steward taking only what was needed, letting the woods heal. He built a good life, never fearing the day the trees would run out. Then the corporations rolled in like a storm front with their clear-cuts and quotas, their worship of quarterly profits. Now, he sighed, we're cutting in the forbidden groves just to feed the machine. So, what is our verse in this poem? I asked, because this man knew the rhythm of the industry in a way I never could. We fight for new covenants, Steve declared. Longer seasons of rest for the land, smaller cuts of sanctuary for the old growth. It will mean lean times for a while, but the jobs that remain will have roots. The way we're going, we'll have logged ourselves into oblivion within 20 years anyway. He then agreed to speak to the scout troop to teach them a new respect for the woods. He also began gathering his fellow loggers, weaving together a coalition to stand against the industry's most rapacious appetites. I never could have written such a plot twist, but Steve Johnson became one of my most profound and powerful allies. If you believe in the power of changing hearts, do me a favor and tap that like button. 3 months after the passing of the Watcher, I made the pilgrimage again to its memorial. It was deep January, the world draped in a blanket of snow, the forest hushed and holy in winter's grasp. This journey had become my ritual, a visit every few weeks to keep vigil, to lose myself in what one might call meditation, or perhaps a prayer whispered to the pines. This time, I carried an offering, a letter I had penned to the Watcher, a chronicle of all that had unfolded since its great silence. I wrote of the Boy Scout program, which had since tripled in size, a small fellowship of the wild. I wrote of the legal battles that were now a shield slowing the axe in the most sacred of habitats. I described the coalition Steve was forging, the bridges I was building with environmental clans and tribal elders, all the tiny seeds that were beginning to crack their shells in the frozen ground. I read the letter aloud to the stones, my breath a fleeting ghost in the crystalline air. I do not know if these words find you, I said. I do not know if there is a shore beyond this one, if your essence still lingers in the wind, or if the end is simply a quiet closing of a book. But I need you to know I honored my promise. I remembered. I have carried your words like a torch. I planted seeds. I paused, my eyes tracing the lines on the snow-covered rocks. You asked if we could change, if we could awaken in time. That is a question to which I still have no answer. The cliff's edge is still before us, and our momentum is terrifying, but some of us are pressing the brakes. Some of us are fighting for the wheel. It may not be enough. In truth, it will probably not be enough. But we are trying. The wind offered a soft reply, shaking a cascade of snow from the high branches. In the cathedral quiet of that winter forest, a peace washed over me that I had not felt since before Tommy's passing. It wasn't the peace of victory. The war was far from won. It was the peace of purpose of a soul finding its true north and walking the path. Thank you, I whispered. Thank you for the gift of your story. Thank you for breathing life back into my own. Thank you for showing me that even at the very end, having witnessed a century of ruin, you still guarded the small, fierce flame of hope. I will carry that flame. I promise. On the long descent, I pondered the Watcher's final wisdom, that every small act matters, that hope is a seed in winter, dormant but alive. That we humans are a paradox, young, reckless, and terrified, but also woven from the stuff of stars capable of impossible greatness. My thoughts drifted to Ryan Martinez, who lit a spark that became his school's recycling program, and to Dorothy Williams, who transformed her quiet library into a harbor for environmental truth. Share this story if you know someone who is planting their own seeds of change. I thought of Steve Johnson, a modern-day Johnny Appleseed sowing wisdom among his fellow loggers. Of Mary Running Deer, a warrior poet whose spirit had carved a path for indigenous rights and environmental protection for decades, a river of resolve against stone. They were all seeds, as a poet might say, patient in the earth's dark womb. Some would burst forth in sudden green fire. Others would lie dormant, dreaming through seasons of frost and sun. Some, perhaps, might never break the surface, but their potential was there, a silent promise in the soil. The Watcher's question haunted me like an unfinished verse, can humans change? I still had no grand sweeping answer to that epic question, but I could offer this humble stanza some of us were trying, and maybe, just maybe, in that trying lay our salvation. What do you think is trying enough? Let me know. in the comments below. 6 moons had waxed and waned after the Watcher's passing when I stood on a stage in a packed Pine Ridge town hall. The timber company had proposed a final chapter for the last ancient groves in the region. The irony was a bitter poem. They sought to harvest the very sanctuary where I had witnessed a century of wisdom fade. The room was a fractured land split down the middle with loggers and their families a rugged shoreline on one side, and a tide of environmentalists and worried citizens on the other. The tension was not an absence of noise but a held breath, a blade honed sharp. I had been asked to be the speaker a strange and untested bridge, a détour spanning the chasm between 2 communities who often saw each other as characters from different stories. Steve Johnson stood among his crew, offering me a nod that was a silent prayer. Dorothy Williams sat with the Environmental Assembly, her daughter Jennifer, a bright flame of hope at her side. Mary Running Deer was also present, her delegation from the Klamath tribes lending the weight of ages to the room, and in the shadows of the back row I saw a flicker of the future Ryan Martinez with his mother. The boy, a young diplomat, had convinced his parents to come and read from both books of the argument. 6 months ago, I began my voice a single stone cast into the room's silent pool. I met a soul in those mountains who rewrote the story of my life. Someone who had seen over a century of seasons turn. Someone who was a living library of the forest's epic from first sprout to towering canopy, and who then read the tragic final pages we have written in just a few decades. I told them the legend of the Watcher, not as a creature of myth, but as a testament focusing on his long, sorrowful poem of a century's witness of the terrible truth of seeing the abyss and walking toward it with open eyes, and of the final, fragile verse of hope that we might yet turn the ship from the rocks. The question before us tonight, I continued, is not truly a line item on a proposal. It is about the story we will tell of ourselves. Will our chapter be the one that speaks of felling the last ancient cathedrals of wood for the fleeting jingle of coin? Or will we be the generation that drew a line in the earth, declared no more, and dared to seek a new verse? I turned my gaze to Steve Johnson and his workers. The loggers in this room are not the villains of our story. They are people trying to write a tale of survival for their families with a craft passed down through generations. They deserve our honor, and they deserve a future. Then my eyes found the other shore of the room, the environmental groups. And the people who stand guard over these woods are not naive dreamers whispering to the trees. They are the keepers of a sacred truth that once a masterpiece is burned, it is gone forever. They too have earned our respect. The true antagonist in this tale, I said, is a cold calculus that forces a choice between our daily bread and the very air we breathe. A system that sees a forest not as a living poem but as mere lumber on a ledger. One that measures value only in board feet and quarterly profits. I drew out the carved pendant Mary Running Deer had given me, the one that had blessed the Watcher's memorial. In the tradition of the first peoples, decisions are made with the 7th generation in mind. What world are we leaving for the children of our children's children's children? Will their stories still have forests to walk in? Will their songs tell of clean water to drink? Will their sky be a friend or a foe? The room fell into a profound silence heavy with choices. I could see some people nodding, others shifting, wrestling with the words. But every single soul was listening. If this story is resonating with you, hit that like button to show your support. I'm not calling for an end to the axe, I continued. I am calling for a new rhythm. A rhythm of patience, of selective cutting, a careful dance with the woods. A vow to protect the ancient ones and sacred habitats. A promise of jobs that last because we are working in harmony with the forest's own pulse of rebirth, not against it. I scanned the crowd, trying to meet as many eyes as I could. The Watcher lived for 102 years. Most of us in this room will be fortunate to see 80. Our lives are but a fleeting chapter in this world's long book. What will our pages say? What seeds will we plant? What story will we leave behind? A wise friend once told me that we are not asked to save the entire world. We are simply asked to tend to our own small part of it. This choice tonight, in this room, this is our part. We can choose the well-trodden path, the one that leads to the same precipice we now face, or We can choose the path less traveled by. It will be harder, I have no doubt, but it is the only one that leads to a horizon to a future worthy of the name. I stepped back from the microphone. That is all I have to say. Whatever you decide, decide with the seventh generation in your hearts. Choose as if the world hangs in the balance, for in truth it does. Every choice a ripple. The vote that night, a single verse and a long poem, didn't rhyme perfectly with the hopes of the environmental groups, yet it wasn't a clean victory for the timber barons either. A truce was drawn, a compromise hammered out on the anvil of debate limited logging in designated zones, with ironclad protections for the ancient groves, the silent leafy cathedrals, and the vital sanctuaries for wildlife. It was not the promised land, but it was a step out of the desert. It was progress. After the gavel fell, figures from both sides of the chasm approached me. Some with words of gratitude, others with arguments still burning, but every one of them was now part of the conversation. The storm in the room had not passed, but the thunder had softened. Voices were bridging the divide, searching for that first patch of solid earth to stand on together. It was then that Ryan Martinez caught my arm as I turned to leave. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, his voice earnest. "My dad, he wanted me to tell you he still thinks you've lost your marbles, but he also said, you might just be the right kind of mad." A laugh escaped me, a sound so foreign it startled even myself. "In this world, I'll take that as the highest praise." "He also said," Ryan's tone shifted, growing somber, "that he's grateful someone is looking out for the seventh generation to come, even if it ties his hands at work." As the headlights cut through the darkness on my drive home, the watcher's question echoed in my mind. A ghost in the machine. Could our species ever truly change? And the answer I realized was not a simple yes or no. It was a mosaic of maybes. Some could change. Some would. Some were already heaving the great stone of effort uphill. It wasn't a chorus, but it was a note of hope. And sometimes a single note is all you need to start a symphony. 1 year later, I found myself standing before the Watcher's Memorial, bathed in the crisp gold of an October morning, exactly 1 year since our first encounter. The stones stood sentinel, untouched by man, but cloaked now in a velvet of moss and a tapestry of autumn leaves. Mary, Running Deer's pendant, remained a steadfast heart on the cairn's chest, weathered by the seasons but unbroken. "It's been a full turn of the wheel," I spoke into the quiet air, a pilgrimage of one. "I thought you'd want a report on the harvest, to know what forests have grown from the seeds you gave me." And so I began my chronicle for the Watcher, of the education program, a fire of knowledge now warming 6 schools in the county, and of Steve Johnson's Sustainable Forestry Coalition, an alliance that was beginning to bend the ear of power. I spoke of the legal shields now guarding our most fragile habitats, and of the local scout troop that had grown to a small army of 30 young guardians, many of them now bearing the torch of advocacy for the wild world. "Ryan Martinez, he's applying to colleges," I said, a smile touching my lips. "He wants to learn the language of the wilderness, wildlife biology. He said it's all because of the wisdom you passed to me and that I in turn passed to him. Your words are not echoes, Watcher. They are roots spreading deep and pushing up new life." A silence fell then as I considered the landscape of my own altered soul. The man who hid in the shadows is gone. The ghost of a soldier barricaded in his cabin and his heart afraid of the world. He is no more. I'm a thread in a tapestry now, woven into a community, a movement, a struggle with real stakes. The wind sighed through the pines and I smiled. If you believe in the power of community, hit that like button to show your support. "You were right," I whispered, "about the spark of greatness hidden in the human heart. I've seen that spark ignite this past year, in the searching eyes of children asking why, in the defiant voices of workers demanding more, in the unyielding spirits of activists, and in the quiet grace of tribal elders sharing the wisdom of ages. We are a young and foolish species, terrified of the dark, just as you said. But we are not made of stone. We are capable of profound transformation. Some of us, anyway." I laid my hand on the memorial, feeling the cool, steady pulse of the stone. "I miss you, my friend. I wish your eyes could have seen this new dawn, but perhaps in some way they have. Your legacy is not in stone, but in breath. Your hope is not a memory, but a living fire. The seeds you placed in my care are taking root, and I make you this vow," I declared, my voice finding a strength I didn't know it had. "I will continue to sow them. I will continue to be your storyteller. I will continue the long fight for the children of the 7th generation, for the silent brotherhood of trees, and for a future worthy of the name. Not for the certainty of victory, but because you taught me the nobility of the struggle, that every single act matters." As if on cue, a spear of sunlight pierced the canopy, anointing the memorial in a cascade of gold. And in that moment, a peace settled over me, profound and absolute. Not the quiet peace of a finished war, but the vibrant peace of a worthy battle, fully and truly joined. It was the peace that comes when your life's purpose beats in time with your every action. The Watcher's question had haunted me. Could humanity change? And after a year of bearing witness, of striving, of planting those seeds of hope, I finally had my answer. We could. Some of us would. And that glimmer of light would have to be enough. Because in the end, as the Watcher whispered with its last breath, everything matters. Let me know in the comments what is one small thing you can do that matters. Everything.